and it was during the, oh, we're in the webinar now. I wonder if we need to start over. Anyway, as you said, I got here last Wednesday, so it was sort of in the middle of the truce, in the middle of the pause. And then, of course, the fighting started again on Friday morning. So I'll tell you what I'm seeing and the ways it is. Well, it's not normal at all, but I'll tell you some of the observations I have. I used to say when I was here, 8 and 10 years ago, I felt like the whole place was in a sort of PTSD from the second Intifada. And I'm certainly not the first to say that, there's just a lot of trauma everywhere here, or as they say in Israel, trauma. And so you get off the plane and you see signs for shelters, and there are hazakot alarms frequently. I went to the Hostage Square to the rally for the hostages last Saturday night after Motzei Shabbat, and on the way home on the bus, we had a siren, and we had to get off of the bus and shelter on the side of the road. And then again today, I was down in kibbutz near Oz with a group of journalists, and as we were just about to leave the kibbutz, there was a siren, and so we had to crouch down next to a cement wall. So there's that. There's people are much more aware of where are the shelters. There are posters for the hostages everywhere and Israeli flags everywhere, and a lot of B'yachad ninatzeach, together we will win kind of signs. There's also, I saw on the road to Tel Aviv, there was a sign saying mechdal, which means neglect. So there's just a tiny bit of the purchase, but there's a sense of real unity. I mean, people are getting back to work, I would say, except for the people who are most sort of centrally affected. But everybody is also kind of doing double duty in some volunteer capacity. Many people are going once a week with different groups down to the south to help pick produce for the farmers whose workers are gone. People are everybody seems to be making food. It's a very Jewish way of doing this, making food and sending it to soldiers here and there. And everybody has somebody deployed, dead, abducted. And there's the first tier and the second tier, and people are, it depends how close you are and who you're closest to. But when I was in shul last Shabbat, my friend who I went with was pointing out to me, we sat down next to her, she has a Chatan Chadash, a new groom. One of her children just got married. He's in Gaza in a tank and hasn't taken his shoes off for a month, they said. And then she pointed out the Gabanit at the shul. It was a Shira Chadasha, for those of you who know. So the Gabanit is working as in the army, working to help identify women's bodies. So it's that kind of stuff is everywhere. But I went to a restaurant. There are people eating in restaurants as well.
Tourism, anything one of the big drivers of the Israeli economy, is that gone?
Mostly, I would say tourism, I think, is gone. And, you mentioned the Israeli economy. This war is estimated to be costing the economy $1 billion shekels a day. It's about $250 million or more a day. That's both in terms of hard costs to run the war and in terms of lost productivity. So it's a big deal. I would say I don't know that there's any tourism in the traditional sense, but there are a couple of different kinds of things going on that are not that different, I guess. Cousins of mine are on a mission they're part of this volunteer group of Americans they're working on a farm. And Taglit Birthright has started a whole new thing to have people come for 2 or 4 weeks to volunteer in different ways. So that's happening. And then yesterday I sort of ran into, it was funny, it was my wedding anniversary, and I ran into the rabbi who married me, which is weird. Rabbi Elliot Cosgrove, who also is a contributor to the Forward. Anyway, he has a bus of Park Avenue synagogue members who have come to sort of bear witness and to have briefings, and they had gone to Kibbutz Kfar Aza yesterday, and he said he saw other buses of Jewish Americans coming to learn and see and volunteer. And so there's a decent amount of that going on. I don't think it's really tourism, but
Jodi, you wrote this piece.
Hotel.
you wrote this piece, which appeared in today's on today's website, today's forward, a harrowing story of a family that was sheltered for 27 hours while terrorists were shooting, attacking, bombing, trying to smoke them out, trying to burn them out. Really one of the most visceral stories I've read about what happened down there. And it seems one thing I took away from it is the last line where they're not sure they're going to go back to Kfar Aza. They're not sure they're going to go back to the south. And I just wonder if what you are seeing is, Israel's gone through these traumas. It's gone through the second Intifada. It's gone through, other wars in Gaza. But this does seem like a bigger shift in society, like something more permanent, something deeper.
I think so. I think that's right. I mean, one of the first pieces I wrote 2 days after the war, I wrote a column called, the title was "Everything I Thought I Knew About Israel and Gaza Was Wrong." Yeah. And I do think that holds. I think that this was a paradigm-shattering event, and the last 9 weeks have been paradigm-shattering for people on all sides. Certainly for Jewish Israelis, also for Arab Israelis, also for Palestinians in the West Bank, also for people in Gaza, also for analysts, also for American Jews, for people on campuses in America. And I think that we are in a new place. There are a lot of the same figures and the same underlying kind of issues, but we are in a new place. And I think that is people here, I would say the overwhelming sense I have reconnecting with friends and old sources is a sense of shakenness, of being unsettled, and sort of not that what you thought you knew, you can't rely on anymore. And the most fundamental piece of that for Jewish Israelis especially is this contract, really, this unwritten or written contract with the society about being safe. And so yeah, and they didn't really say they're not sure they don't want to go to Kfar Aza. They said they're not going back to Kfar Aza. Now I'll say, and this couple's 30 years old. They have a 3-year-old and a 5-month-old baby. He grew up on Kfar Aza, and when they met and fell in love, she said she knew she wanted to raise her kids there, but they were sure they were not going back. So today I was in Nir Oz, and we're walking around with a woman who grew up there, but who doesn't live there now, and whose father was taken hostage. And we run into this old man. He was 86, and somehow his house was spared. He was in his safe room. Nothing happened to his house. I saw his house. There's no damage. They just skipped his house. One neighbor's dead. One neighbor's abducted, and nothing happened to him. Anyway, he has moved back. 2 weeks ago, he just moved back to the kibbutz. The kibbutz is like an army base. It's like an army base, and there's also people looking for evidence, making sure they have everything they need. And but there's like army guys sleeping in the children's house. There's all this army gear set up there, and there's this old man, and he's just staying there. He rides a motorcycle, and he's sitting there, and we were like, what are you doing here, or why did you come back now? And he says, I don't have any other home. This guy's lived there since I think 1957, a year after the kibbutz. This is my home. So I think some people will go back, but the relationship that people have to the place, to Gaza, to any kind of coexistence efforts, to each other, is changing. I mean, it's really changing, and I don't know if it will go back or if it'll just come to something new.
In a couple of the pieces you wrote, you kind of reflected the anger people are feeling towards the government, and I guess I wonder how that's going to manifest itself when the war winds down, and also how people are dealing with this issue that the people that got them into this mess, or that they partially blame for this mess, are also responsible for getting them out of it. How, is there any trust?
Yeah. It's confusing. I mean, as you know, Israel was convulsed for a year over this government, cleaved really in a way that we hadn't seen, and some people say forever, over the questions around democracy, really, and racism, and the judicial reform proposal, and that is gone. I mean, very few people openly want to talk about that at all. There is the polls show unbelievable unity among Jewish Israelis behind the war and the stated goal to eliminate Hamas. Something like 95% of Jewish Israelis support that today. They also want the hostages back, but they're not focused on the potential conflict between those goals. And something like 70% of Israelis want Netanyahu gone right afterwards. But they're not, but there's also a sense of unity. Last Shabbat lunch, I had some lunch with some of my closest friends here. Their oldest son is 19 and really just in training in the army. He's not like deployed in Gaza. So he was home with his girlfriend. And there was a conversation at the lunch table about whether to go. There are different things. So there used to be all these protests on Saturday night about democracy. So last Saturday night, there's a hostage vigil in Tel Aviv in what's called now Hostage Square. And then there were two different events in Jerusalem, one that was for the hostages and similar, and one at the Knesset that, or outside the Knesset that was more political. And my friend's son, Tuvia, he's just said, it's not time for protest now. And this is, this is a leftist kind of family.
Right.
And he's very, very forceful in his soldierness. It's just not time. Like, we are fighting a war. And I think you get that sense everywhere. My sense is that the country is really unified in a feeling of we need to destroy Hamas and whatever it takes. And that the people who were on the left feel a little bit guilty about how they feel, about their changed feeling about the Palestinians, and the people on the center right feel a little vindicated and not guilty.
How you got there, as I think the hostage releases were done, was by the time you got there?
No, a couple more rounds. I got here Wednesday at 2, so we had 2 more sets of releases before it ended.
How are Israelis dealing with this disconnect between, the chances of releasing more hostages and the fighting in Gaza? I mean, it seems like those two things aren't necessarily compatible.
Yeah. I mean, first I'll just say there's this interesting phenomenon. So those of you who've been to Israel, after you get off the plane, you walk down that kind of long, it's not really a hallway, it's kind of a big expanse, and there's a downhill. So they have the hostage posters are placed every few feet. And as I got off on Wednesday, there were a bunch of the ones that had been taken away, of the people who'd already gotten out. And I've been experiencing that in different modes. I'm still saying Kaddish for my dad. I went to a minyan and they hand out cards to say the names of the captives during the prayer for the captives, and they had things crossed out. And then on some of the posters, people have placed white doves next to the people who've come home. And at the hotel where the people from Kfar Aza are staying, as I wrote in my story today, they've put stickers next to those names that say Kfar Aza is my home, and also taken down the photographs of the people who've gotten out. So you have everywhere this duality.
I loved in one of your stories, you had the dreidel, the Hanukkah dreidels. It's had.
Oh yeah. Oh, it's in my hotel. I would show it. Yeah, they have the bring them home now.
Yeah.
So I think there is this interesting tension between the embrace of those who've come home and the relief, and then the fear that the next round of hostages might be much harder to negotiate for. Yesterday, there was a meeting between the hostage families and Netanyahu that apparently got quite ugly. The hostage families were quite angry, and there's some audio leaked of it. You've probably seen it on some of the Israeli websites. And I know, like, I talked to this, as I said, I was with this woman today whose father is still there. He's 79 years old. And yeah, I think she doesn't see the horizon for how it's going to happen. And I had a long interview with Rachel Goldberg, Poland Hirsch's mom, who's, I think, become really the international face of the hostage crisis. She is an incredible woman with poise and dignity. And I don't know where she's getting all this strength. And, she wears a sticker on her shirt each day with the number of days he's been in captivity. And it's painful. It's just painful. So I think it's, you started with, are people getting back to normal? I mean, at some point, people are going to go back to, there's all these competing kind of dynamics of getting back to normal and fighting a war and fighting for the hostages and worrying about the day after all at the same time. So there's it's a lot of heaviness here.
Do you get the sense that Israelis are more about bring home the hostages or more about destroy Hamas, or are they just confused and caught in between?
I mean, I would say both from the actual polls and from my conversations. I think people, even though there is I'm a political analyst, I'm going to try to think about the goals and are they in conflict? I understand why people think they might be in conflict, but I think here people feel them just like equally powerfully, that they want to destroy Hamas and get the hostages. And the government is kind of saying they can do those things at the same time. And there's sort of, I think, a hope and a belief that that's true. I think people on the left at home in the US, or maybe not just on the left, there are people who are like trying to say we should prioritize the hostages over, you should have a ceasefire to get the hostages. I think people here don't see that as happening. And so they are still, most people, I think, really do want to destroy Hamas and finish the war, whatever that means to different people. I don't, and I think the fact that the children were released probably makes that easier, although it's of course not easy to have 136 men, still a few women behind bars. I mean, not behind bars, in tunnels. Sorry.
If you put your Q&A, your questions in the Q&A, I will happily read those out to Jodi, or Jodi could see them for herself too. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A. Jodi, how much are Israelis looking at what is happening in Gaza, the death and destruction in Gaza, and having any reaction to that, or what is the reaction to that? We know that it's caused a lot of reaction around the rest of the world.
Yeah. Good question, Rob. I mean, I don't want to overestimate what I know from my week talking to people and looking around. I have heard a number of smart people that I respect and who have openly said that their level of empathy has dropped to close to zero over what is happening. I don't think that's everybody. I mean, I think many people feel as I do, and as I think you do, which is that, every human life is, precious, and that civilians dying is tragic. But I do think there are some people who are, really are openly, or at least in a comfortable setting, realizing that they feel, so angry about what happened on October 7th, and even more angry about the polls they see about Palestinians either denying what happened on October 7th or saying that they supported Hamas's attack. And so it has, that has plummeted kind of empathy for what is happening there. I also think, though, there's a separate phenomenon, which is not exactly like, you asked if people are paying attention or care about what's happening to Palestinians. I feel like there's this other vector, which is that there's so much disinformation on social media, and there's so much discussion over whether the mainstream media is treating the sides fairly, that I think there's a deflection of this question of paying attention to what's happening in Gaza or to the Palestinians in Gaza, because they're talking instead or thinking instead about deflecting the debate. They're very angry at the international community for what it is saying about what's happening in Gaza, or for the way it's portraying, like there's, people are incredibly upset about anybody who talks about the end of the ceasefire without particularly blaming Hamas for blowing up the negotiations. People are very angry at what the head of the UN is saying about the humanitarian crisis or about who's responsible for the trucks not getting in. Or so they really are focused on the ways in which Israel is being, in their minds, unfairly blamed. And that is like deflecting their vision from the actual thing. Also, you don't see the pictures here that you see in our media. So you have not of like the, not as much, not of the devastating bloody children. And then you do see the funeral of the soldiers. You know, it's right, and it's right there. So I think that it's easier to look away, and people aren't trying so hard to look.
Mm-hmm. And the story of how the rape of women and the you know, all the atrocities that were directed at women during the October 7th, that is, you know, become a huge story here, as you know. Is it a huge story in Israel? Yes. And
it is a huge story here. This is another, I think it's a real serious story. It is unconscionable the way that the women's movement has, including UN Women, has up until 10 minutes ago or so, right? Not acknowledged and expressed outrage over what happened to women on October 7th and possibly after. And I think people are very, very upset about that. And I think it's a part of this deflection.
Part of the deflection, in other words, the focus on it is part of the...
I mean, like, let's talk about the world's not paying enough attention to the sexual assault and sexual violence against women, rather than talk about what's happening to the Palestinian civilians. I mean, look, I feel like every column I've written since October 7th, and maybe a lot before, is all about holding both. You know, I do think we have to, the you know, the Jewish thing to do is to look both at, I think I wrote in my column after I watched the IDF film of the atrocities of October 7th, is, you know, you have to watch the film and bear witness to those atrocities, and you have to also look at what's happening in Gaza. It's very, very hard to do when you are here and in, as they say, trauma, and also in fear. I mean, it's like fear and anguish and all that stuff together. Like, I understand, you know, so I was talking to, I was interviewed earlier today by someone who's writing an article for Politico about how the Jewish press in America has been handling the coverage. And we were talking a little bit about this, about what our audience, you know, wants and can handle right now. And I said that, like, and I wonder how you think about this, Rob. I mean, I think it's like, it's fine if people feel that right now they can kind of only focus on the pain and the crisis that is closest to them. I understand that. And I think we have to be empathetic to that too. And I think you and me have to keep doing the other thing and looking at the whole 360 view. And we're going to keep publishing articles like that and opinion columns that are across a range of perspectives. And I understand if some of them are too hard for people to read right now.
Yeah,
but I think
I also get the sense that American Jewish society is a little more divided on this than Israeli Jewish society. I think we're reflecting more of those divisions in America among American Jews. Norman Moskowitz asked a question that I was going to get around to, which is, I quoted some statistics in a column I wrote about how Israeli Arabs are more identified now with the state of Israel than they were, according to polls, before October 7th, which I thought was a pretty interesting, remarkable. And I don't know if you saw Lucia Harish, the Arab Israeli newscaster, give this passionate attack against Hamas on her news program, you know, tearful, passionate. This is not Islam. And are you seeing that? And what do you, I mean, that seems to be some kind of glimmer of hope or optimism in this whole thing, that you actually have Israeli Arabs and Bedouins. We've read those stories.
Yeah, the Bedouin and the Druze are like very, first of all, affected, and also very engaged in their Israeliness right now. So it's like a yes and situation, Rob. I spent an hour or so yesterday with Mohammed Darasha from Givat Haviva, who some forward readers may remember, because we had 2 years ago, we had a Zoom with him. and he's so wise and thoughtful and empathetic and but it was I found the conversation a little depressing because, so first of all, Mohammed's cousin was killed on October 7th. He was a medic who was working at the Nova Music Festival, and I'm not sure if he was working there or was just attending, but he ended up giving medical care to some of the victims and then was killed. And he said, nobody's acknowledging the pain. There are also Israeli Arabs who are abducted, and there's like not a validation of the Israeli Arab pain. That was one thing he said. He definitely expressed something similar to Lucy about, this is not only is this not the Islam we know, this is not the kind of Palestinian identity that resonates with us. This is not the national aspiration that resonates with him. But then Mohammed also shared with me some other data that the polls you cite are correct, but there's also data, like he told me that 20% of the Israeli Arab students who are supposed to start in universities on December 24th, 20% of them have made other arrangements to go to other universities in the West Bank or in Jordan or in America or wherever. I think he said that there's 20, he's been working very hard to create he has a cross-sector educational program. So Jews teach in Arab schools in Israel and Arabs teach in Jewish schools. And some huge number of those teachers have not been going to work. He said hundreds of Israeli Arabs have been arrested for things they've posted on social media or said. Right. And also hundreds have been told not to come to work. Please don't come to work now. It's not come. And then it was interesting I met with Mohammed at the Imbal Hotel. He was actually speaking to the Park Avenue Synagogue folks after meeting with me. That's why we were meeting there. And I asked him a little bit about, how does he feel personally? And he said, well, I made an arrangement to park in the garage because I'm afraid that if I walked outside to go to my car on the street, I might get attacked. And the number of gun permits that have been issued, Ben Gvir is trying to get more civilians to own guns, and there's some huge increase in the number of gun permits. So I did not come away from the Mohammed conversation quite as hopeful as that poll made me feel.
There's a lot of questions about the West Bank I wanted to talk to you about. A couple of things. One is, are Israelis hearing and reading, and how are they reacting to these reports of vigilantism, murder taking place, land appropriation under the cover of this war taking place on the West Bank? It's getting a lot of press here, as you know. I wonder if it's getting any press or reaction in Israel. When you start, then I had a follow-up.
I feel like I want to call I'm sitting at the Wyman Kelmans, and I feel like I want to ask them that question. I'm going to ask Levi to come over. Because my answer would be, the question was, is the settler violence and the ways that what's happening in the West Bank, the violence and settlers activity, people like sort of under the cover of war, the increasing in that, is that getting a lot of attention here? And my first answer would be no.
I would say no. It's covered in Haaretz, but that means it's read by us. It's got a constituency.
Levi was involved in Rabbis for Human Rights, and I know the Rabbis for Human Rights went over to the West Bank to help Palestinians pick olives, recently. But it's not an A story. It's not a B story. I think most Israelis think that settler violence, that what happened last year in Hawara, is the worst thing. It's terrible. No, very few people think that's a good idea, but it's one of those things people are not talking about now.
People really hate Ben Gvir. I think he's really loathed, right up there with Bibi and Smotrich, and especially the latest attempt to do a march, about taking control of the Waqf control away from the Temple Mount. It's clear that that's just going to needlessly inflame things. So people blame Ben Gvir for that, and they blame him for the violence.
People are concerned about international legitimacy because they think people are so committed to the idea that this war effort in Gaza needs to be serious, that people need to feel safe, that Hamas will not be able to attack again. And so they know that international legitimacy plays a role in that, how much room Israel has to prosecute the war. And so I'm sure that, like, if they sit down and start to think logically like that, they know that violence in the West Bank is bad for the international position, but people are not thinking about that.
People aren't thinking logically right now. People are thinking, people are feeling, not thinking. You know, a lot of people really feel like anything we do, we're going to get attacked, you know, anyway. So
I will also say, like, this goes back to something we were talking about at the beginning, Rob, but like, people are very busy in volunteering here and going to support somebody there, and their own soul, you know, the WhatsApp group with their own deployed relatives. And so people are, and consuming the news, of course, but so you can stay very busy supporting the war and witnessing and testifying and so you can kind of close out the things that are more difficult to think about.
I'd say everybody's bandwidth is really limited now, because we are, all of us, a terrible combination of so sad and so stressed and so scared and so worried about the future of this country and so angry, so furious at the failure of the army and the terrible lack of leadership. And people, I think, are just, you know, depression leads to exhaustion. I mean, that's a symptom of depression, and people are really depressed.
I think also one of the things you're saying, but not saying pointedly, is there's not a lot of intellectualization going on. I don't think people are spending a lot of time in the, like, let's think about what the, and, you know,
I mean, there are pundits who write things, you know.
Yeah, but I feel like that's not the conversation people are having. They're not debating
if Netanyahu's able, I mean, if they're able to have some, you know, quiet Gaza in whatever way they choose to quiet Gaza, and if they're able to kill a lot of these Hamas leaders, and if they're able to return, say, most of the hostages, if not all the hostages, will that quiet a lot of the criticism, or will that change the outcome for the IDF and for these leaders that got Israel into this mess, or will they still be facing retribution and punishment in the polls and in the streets?
I mean, right now, I had dinner last night with Yochanan Plesner of the Israeli Democracy Institute, who's former Knesset member and very, very engaged in these questions. I think that, you know, the polls seem to show right now that, you know, people want Netanyahu to win the war or finish the war and then go. And I think there's some coalescing around Benny Gantz, the former IDF chief who joined the war cabinet and who's really a, you know, a center right to right figure. There's some questions about, you know, will there be political leaders that might emerge from the protest movement, particularly Brothers in Arms, which transformed instantly to this incredible civilian Homefront Command kind of effort. But I think people feel that, there's like, let's get the war finished, and then let's both get rid of the guys who screwed up and look into exactly how they screwed up this badly.
I think another group that might emerge are the relatives of people who were killed,
the hostages,
who have unbelievable legitimacy when they speak, and when they call for the ouster of Bibi, I just think that's going to grow and grow.
It is interesting. You know, I spoke at the beginning about Rachel Goldberg. She sort of adopted now Rachel Goldberg Poland, so that her name is resonant with her son's name. Being, you know, I think we see her kind of everywhere, and she's really the face in international circles. It is interesting. So everybody here knows the name of so many hostages and so many of the murdered, and they know the stories, and they know how, I mean, and so many of them are so articulate, and so I think that's really interesting. It was interesting last Saturday night. I think I wrote this in my story at Hostage Square. There was like zero politics. They worked very hard. Hostages, no blame, no complaints. I said earlier, it blew up in the private meeting yesterday. But that I think will be an increasing tension. When do we talk about
that? Can't maintain itself. There, you mentioned there's really a tension between those that say, you talked about Friday night dinner. There's a real tension between those that say now's not the time to protest, now's not the time to call for Bibi's ouster, and those that say we're already weeks late in doing this. And that's people feel really strongly about both of them.
Do Israelis have a clear sense of what victory looks like? I mean, do they really think that they could wipe out Hamas? Do they really think they could,
The thing I keep hearing more than anything is, I mean, Israelis, I think, are realistic. Someone said to me last night, we know we can't wipe out the idea of Hamas, the idea of this, armed resistance. Because I know a lot of people in America are like, if you kill every Hamasnik, you're just going to create a new generation of radicals or a new generation. And so I think they know that that's true. The real issue is the idea that Hamas cannot control Gaza anymore in the way it has since 2007. And the idea now there's emerging this conversation around an Israeli buffer zone, a sort of security protected zone. There's a few radical folks who want to go back and build settlements inside Gaza. I do not think that is it's not to say it's not a majority review would give much more credence than it deserves. It's like a tiny sliver view.
On the other hand, they're in the government, they're a tiny sliver.
Yeah.
So they're not without influence. It's not going to happen, but they're not without influence.
But I think most, I would say I'm hearing much more in Israel that maybe there could be an international force or something than you hear at home. In America, nobody thinks that, because that involves US troops on the ground and nobody wants that. I think similarly, you hear Biden, I think he's backing off of this, but you hear Biden and some other people talking about a revitalized Palestinian Authority. Nobody here believes that the Palestinian Authority has any hope of being strong enough to control Gaza in a way that feels okay to Israel. Is that fair to say? Nobody here is an exaggeration. I mean, I don't mean to. I haven't spoken to everyone in the country.
The Palestinian Authority is completely discredited in Palestinian society and in Israeli society.
And it's not like American Jews don't know that, or that Washington doesn't know that, but like there's still some idea that there could be. And I think here there's really not.
So there's
people are not grappling today though with the okay, so if Hamas can't control Gaza and the PA can't control Gaza and probably the US isn't going to do much, what's going to be? People are not really in that very practical sense of.
That's the bad news. That's unless people are thinking about that, then what are we doing? And
well, somebody somewhere is thinking about that, but not around the Shabbat table.
I don't think if you ask me, I don't think anybody, especially in the government, I don't think they're thinking that. And I think that's terrifying to me. I don't think anybody's thinking beyond going in there and killing as many Hamas people as possible, which is important and as a total lefty peacenik, I completely support. Sorry.
But how much
I see we have 35 questions there, so I'm going to dismiss you and I'll call you back if I need you again. Anyway.
Well, I'm trying to combine questions, but Jodi, how much, are you getting asked, and how much do you find Israelis concerned about the reaction here in America, the anti-Semitism on campuses and the protesting in front of a falafel shop? I mean, how much are you hearing about that?
Yeah, great question. I have not been asked about it a ton, but the first 24 hours I was here, I was hanging out with a group of American rabbis who were visiting through the Shalom Hartman Institute, and they had been together for a couple of days already, and they said they were asked it a lot.
Mm-hmm. So it's not, is it plain? I mean, are they showing those images in the Israeli media there on TV, which is where most people there?
Yes, they are definitely the media has been covering the reaction in the US a ton. So I'll say something else about this, Rob. It's another, I have felt for a number of weeks now that people are looking for a way to make themselves feel better. I mean, Levi went through all these terrible emotions everybody's grappling with, right? And there's so much awfulness around. And I think people are looking for ways to make themselves feel better about whatever they've decided their side is. And I think for Israeli Jews, for whom it is extremely important that and it's not untrue, I just think the emphasis needs to be for them on the pure anti-Semitism of the attack, that the anti-Semitism in the US is part of that, So I think that I think people understand, the way the occupation has played out for 50 years and why it's not helped anything. But we also saw that there was a desire to destroy Israel itself, and it was born from a very anti-Semitic place. And so I think the anti-Semitism in the US feels like another chit in that grievance. I also think that, you know, here's the thing. It's like at the same moment Israel feels least safe or least able to fulfill its promise as the safe haven for the Jewish people is when it feels from all these reports around the world that you need a safe haven for the Jewish people the most. And I think so that's part of what has helped Israelis feel so resolved to restore this idea and this contract that Israel will be a safe place to be Jewish.
Someone pointed that out. There was an online, about Michael Solomonov, the Israeli-born owner of the restaurant in Philadelphia that was attacked by this mob. They said, look, he left Israel. What more do you want? Like, he's not even, like if Israelis can't even leave Israel and be safe, then they should go back. The message you're sending is so bizarre. There's a good question.
Weird. I will say also, like, our friend Yossi Klein Halevi said the other night, I'm sure he said this more than once, but he said, on October 7th, Israel was the most dangerous place to be Jewish, the most dangerous place to be Jewish in many years. There's nowhere else that you can imagine massacring 1,200 Jewish people in a moment, in a few hours.
I wrote a column in March saying Israel is the most dangerous place to be a Jew.
Right. And it reminds me about when I was here. One of the stories that American Jews were most interested in, that Israelis were least interested in, but that we covered a decent amount in the New York Times, was the struggle over egalitarian prayer at the Western Wall. And, it was, people would talk then, this is the only place where you can't be Jewish the way you want to be Jewish, or you can't practice your Judaism freely the way you want to. And it's that, for me, that statement about this being the most dangerous place to be Jewish is really resonant of that. But that's what the war is about, right? Is restoring that idea that this is the safest place to be Jewish, not the most dangerous.
Is there a concern, Susan Fish asked this, which I think is a great question, is there a concern that the US will not stand by Israel, that somehow, you saw this, they just, the State Department just said that people who protest in the West Bank or people who, Jews or Arabs who commit violence in the West Bank won't be allowed in Israel, just as a way to kind of show that their displeasure with what's going on. But is there a sense that, they could lose American support, or American support will soften, or do they feel very backed up by America
now? Mostly they feel very backed up. I mean, I'm sure there's concern, particularly in the diplomatic sphere. But I haven't seen this myself, but a friend told me that they were selling hats that say the word "don't" on it, which I guess in the very early days, Biden said, like, if you think, if you want to test, I forget the exact quote, but it was something like, if you are thinking about
don't try it, something like that, right?
Yeah, don't. Right. If you're thinking about doing this against Israel, don't. So there's a real sense of, I mean, I think, let me say that, I don't feel like I'm hearing a lot of, like, will we lose American support, or, the worried. I mean, look, I think when people are thinking about the long term, the end game, that sphere, they know that there's some limit to American support. I have heard a few people talk about the timetable, the election timetable, and that they understand that as we get into 2024, that Biden and other people will have electoral considerations. And so I think they're concerned about that. They are definitely very focused, as we were talking about a minute ago, on what they feel is like the abandonment of Israel by a sort of younger generation of leftist Jews. What has happened to the left? What has happened to the young people? But I think they also feel quite buoyed by this sort of shoring up of the American Jewish middle, where people are, I think, more focused on Israel than they've been in a long time.
How are they explaining the abandonment or the opposition among younger American Jews to Israeli government policies or to Israel itself? How are they explaining that? Are they saying these people are misinformed? Are they brainwashed? Are they Like how do they kind of?
I would say I think they're very focused on the misinformed, the sort of like the idea that where did this genocide idea come from kind of thing. TikTok, blaming TikTok.
What about it seems to me one of the big stories that hasn't been written about enough is what's going on with the north of Israel. That as much as you have people like the kibbutzniks you interviewed who are not going back to Kfar Aza, you have people who've been evacuated from the north. I don't know if they're still evacuated. I was
some and some. I think a lot of people are back. I will say it comes up a lot, the north. It's sort of first of all, like, so there's so many people have children or partners or cousins who are deployed, and you hear, I have one deployed in the north and one deployed in Gaza, or so you hear a lot about the north in that way. Also, this has been true since I began covering this conflict, but there's just this sort of overhang of Hezbollah. I've heard like 3 different people have told me, and if Hezbollah gets into this war, 100,000 Israelis will be killed. The rockets are so powerful. So there's still that kind of boogeyman there. The idea
those are Israelis who've told you that. So it's very much on their consciousness because
and some of the volunteerism, I would say, is like, I think I've been in touch. I might go tomorrow night with David Broza he's been doing just like a bunch of concerts for like every group of people that might need to hear his signature song. So I think tomorrow he's going up north and he's like doing a group of soldiers and then a group of evacuees. And so it's like a lot of the volunteer work is also for the north.
It's so remarkable that Israel has shrunken. It's almost back to 1948 borders, much less 1967 borders. You're really talking about just this.
I heard somebody say this the other day. They're like, we're such a small country, and now you've squeezed us into the center, or you've shown that you can squeeze us so easily into the center. And I think, I guess it would be the settlements mean they've expanded very much across the Green Line, but if you shrink it that way, so it's definitely smaller than the 1948 borders if you go north.
Right. So this goes back to my question about the West Bank, and you said that the progressives or the leftists, in Israel have kind of just become, let's do what we need to do. They're not really thinking. But I'm wondering if people don't see or aren't making connections between the way the right has behaved over the last 50 years, or certainly over the last 15 years, and the predicament Israel is in now. Is there any discussion of that in Israeli media, that some of this is because of our policies in the West Bank, some of it's because of, our refusal to deal with the Palestinian Authority in any way?
Well, I would break that question apart a little bit. There's a lot of discussion about the way that Netanyahu's particular approach to deterring Hamas is now sort of objectively proven to have been a failure. This idea that you can deter Hamas by giving economic incentives or by making the price too high to attack, or like all of that seems to have been proven not to have worked. So there's a lot of a sense that the policies towards Gaza and Hamas are a big, massive failure. There's also, of course, a lot of focus on the intelligence failure and the response, the October 7th, and actually continuing. There's continuing complaints about not meeting with hostage families enough, not doing this enough, etc. I do not hear a lot of zoomed out, big picture, 50 years of occupation, 50 years of settlement building under all the governments, taking responsibility for what role that might have played. And I think that's because of the extent of the barbarism, right? Like there's no justification for exactly what happened on October 7th. So to try to pick apart the dynamics, I think feels dangerous. I will say, I did have one person say to me, I'm not forgetting exactly who it was my first couple of days here. We're talking about, it was an American. Anyway, but they were talking about, there's been a lot of ways in which this has been likened to pogroms in our history.
Right.
And this person said, it's not like, not to make an excuse for it, we didn't deserve it, whatever, but this is the only time when we the Jews had done anything that is related to the reason for the attack, as opposed to, the pogroms in Eastern Europe, in the Pale of Settlement, were not, prompted by Jewish expressions of power or whatever. But no, I haven't heard any Israelis talk openly about that, the idea that which you do hear obviously a lot in leftist circles in the US.
Right. How much coverage did the college presidents get on Israeli television or Israeli news? I don't know if you saw
today?
it. Yeah.
There was this hearing, it was today or yesterday, the hearing?
The hearing was yesterday, where they were asked whether you could what your reaction would be if they chanted for genocide for Jews, and how would you respond to that? And the president of Harvard, the president of Penn said, it depends on the context. That was a major story among.
Levi, Paula, how much coverage did the hearing yesterday of the American university presidents get on TV?
Here, I didn't see any.
He said, here, I didn't see any.
I read about it.
He read about it in the American press, but nothing on Israeli TV, which is interesting because they've been pretty obsessed with what's happening on American college campuses, right?
Mm-hmm.
There was a lot of stuff here yesterday. It was a big day of fighting in Khan Yunis, and this big meeting with the hostage families. So I don't know. Anyway, I'm not watching Israeli TV very much, so that's why I asked my friends.
And there seems to be a total blackout of information about what the actual fighting is going on now. At least here, we don't hear, they just say there's fighting in South Gaza, there's fighting in Khan Yunis. You're not even getting casualty reports really from either side. And it just seems that.
Well, so here I would say it's a little different here. I mean, first of all, everybody has on their phones the Red Alert app. And so there's a constant sense of where the rockets from Gaza are coming. Today in the South, I heard a lot of artillery fire and booms, which I think are Israeli firing. There are extensive briefings by Netanyahu and the defense minister and the head of the IDF and the spokespeople about the fighting every day. And there are extensive coverage of injured and killed soldiers every day. So I think those things, and like every household has some WhatsApp group that they're on that is the update on the soldier who is either in or right outside Gaza, and they are waiting for the reports, however often they come, of that. So I think they feel more connected, not in like a tactical way, but some more connection. I will say one of the crazy things about this situation that is part of the everything I thought I knew is wrong kind of thing, or it's at least different, is, the fact that there is no independent journalism happening inside Gaza is like a very big and new bad thing. There are no foreign journalists, no international journalists on the ground in Gaza, except for a handful being taken in and escorted by the IDF. The only way we are getting information out of Gaza is from either Gazan sort of stringers on the ground there, or more likely people inside Gaza speaking to Arabic speaking journalists outside. And I think the other thing that's happening, this is less relevant to us at the Forward, but it's my colleagues at the New York Times. I see how one thing that's just very different from the 2014 war and the 2021 war, which I wasn't here for, but also just the coverage of the conflict in general, is that the coverage is more divided. There are fewer reporters who are talking to people on all sides. There's more of a division. The people who are talking to people in Gaza and the people who are talking to people in Israel. And I think that's not great for our understanding of the war. But there's the only information about the question you asked about the tactics of the war, what is actually happening. The only information is either from the IDF or from the sort of Hamas-run ministries of the victims. And neither of those are something that you should, think of as a full picture.
Which has created this fertile ground for just complete misinformation and disinformation on the internet.
Just dueling narratives. And you can't even find the connection between the narratives. A friend of mine, actually two people, one I saw today and one I saw last night, reporters who were covered the Ukraine war and then have basically come here from the Ukraine war. And we were talking about the, incredible differences there. And, obviously we all have read the heroic journalism from places like Mariupol and other places where people were really on the ground on the front lines covering that war.
Right. But there you have nothing right now inside Gaza. Jodi, we have to wrap up, but I guess my last question. Well, first I want everybody on this. Thank you all for attending this. And I just want you all to look at the Forward website and read Jodi's latest piece on a family that was hiding from Hamas for 27 hours in their kibbutz. It's really just, I think it's a long piece. I don't know. It took, I just couldn't stop.
It's very long.
Yeah, but it doesn't read long, and it just is gripping, and it really shows, I think, where the emotions are at for people in Israel. Like, this is what they've gone through. This is the trauma, as Jodi was saying, and it's just very important. So, Jodi, the last question is, if you had to rate, the sense of hope, the sense of optimism in Israel now compared to your other times, like, do people feel like there's light at the end of the tunnel or hope in the end of this, or where are people's kind of, what's the national mood in that sense? Sorry, you have 30 seconds.
A way to say this that will not sound so harsh, but so there is no, it's funny, tomorrow it's the first night of Hanukkah, and I guess there'll be some light related to that because it is the Festival of Lights. But light is like I don't know if you had to give me, if I had an endless list of words to use to describe the mood here, I don't know when we would get to the word light. There's no lightness here. There's no light or lightness. There's a heaviness. Levi actually asked me at dinner I was telling him about someone I had been meeting with yesterday, and he asked about whether that person was optimistic. And I found myself I realized I didn't ask that question. And I wasn't sure what Levi even meant. Like, was he optimistic about what? I think there's a resolve and a confidence about the war. There's an optimism about the war. I would say there is not an optimism about getting the rest of the hostages out. People probably don't say that too much out loud, but I do not think people feel like, oh yeah, it's just going to be another few weeks and then those guys are all going to come home. There's not an optimism about the situation. This is not true in this house. This is a left-wing house, but in general, most Israelis gave up on the idea of a resolution to the Palestinian conflict or a peace a long time ago. So there's no increased optimism there. And I would say I don't think there's much optimism around kind of Israel itself. There's fear of, there are people, we're coming out also of a year in which people have been not optimistic about Israel's democracy, and now there's not optimistic about Israel's safety. So I do think there's optimism about the basic idea that there's a resolve and a focus and a confidence about the army and the army's ability to deal Hamas if not fatal, a serious blow that will restore some amount of security to Israel in the medium term. But I would say beyond that, there's much more either fear or a sort of like avoiding to think too much about that long-term future. That sounds so dark. I just want to say it is Hanukkah tomorrow. There are going to be candles lit here tomorrow. I think I'm going to go to Hostage Square and light candles with the hostage families. And Levi and Paula are going to light candles with their grandchildren on Friday afternoon. And I think that there'll be some light around that.
Well, there's been 2,000 Hanukkahs or 1,500 Hanukkahs or 1,500 years of Hanukkah in the Jewish world. So there's a good chance there'll be 1,000 more years of Hanukkah. Thank you, Jodi. Thank you for all your insight. Thank you for sharing it with us.
Thanks for being with me, Rob, and for all of your incredibly wise and sensitive columns. Our publisher, our CEO and publisher, Rachel Fishman Feddersen, says about Rob Eshman that he writes what's in our hearts, and I think that's really true. So I'm so grateful for you being part of the forward and for this conversation.
Thanks, Jodi. Be well. Thank you very much. Bye.
Hanukkah.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.